Hey history seekers, today we're at Croxden Abbey, located in Uttoxeter, Staffordshire. The abbey started in 1179 and was suppressed in 1538. We shall see the remains of the abbey, which is now bisected by a road, and the stone coffins near the high altar, and learn about the history. The abbey site is now bisected by a road that cuts diagonally through the church. The east end of the church lies on one side, with the nave south transept and most of the other monastic buildings on the other side. Some walls survive to a height of 18 metres, 60 feet, or more and are finely detailed. Others are foundations, or are hidden under the adjacent farmhouse and other buildings. The precinct to the abbey originally covered 74 acres and was enclosed by a perimeter wall, part of which survive. As we take a look at some of the salvaged stonework from the abbey, here in front of us is the remains of the Cloister archway. Here is a section of the 13th century trefoiled blank arcading. Here is the effigy of a cross-legged knight, probably originally intended to be laid horizontally. A similar, less mutilated monument, dated before 1300s, can be seen in the Draycott Chapel of St Mary's Church. Here in front of us is a foilated capital of the mid-13th century. Bertram de Verden, Lord of Alton, an important local nobleman, founded a Cistercian monastery here in 1176 for the salvation of the souls of his family. The Verden family, originally from Normandy, granted land in Cotton and a few miles north of Croxton to monks from the Cistercian Abbey of Ordeny sur Odon. The monks moved from Cotton to the more remote site of Croxton in 1179. The church was first built, first followed by the buildings around the cloister. Completion and further enlargement followed under the prosperous leadership of Walton London, Abbot in 1242 to 1268, when as many as 70 monks lived here. During the 14th century, the community suffered from the effects of crop failure, cattle disease and plague. Henry VIII eventually suppressed the abbey in 1538, and the site became part of a farm. There is also a map of the buildings. This is a 13th century vault rib. This type of rib appears on the site of the remains of the south transept. This vault boss, bearing a rib type, has been identified as coming from the infirmary. In front of us, we see another vault boss. This is a different design of vault boss. Vault boss. The size of boss 5, 6 and 7 would suggest that they came from high in the church, probably the choir. It seems likely that the nave had a wooden roof and was not vaulted. This is another vault boss. Its size and the vault rib type it bears would suggest that the Boss came from the south transept. The north transept may have been vaulted similarly. In front of us are the remains of the infirmary, with its own dormitory, hall, chapel and kitchen, where the old sick and convalescing monks were cared for. The board in front reads, as was typical in monasteries, the infirmary lies on the east side of the cloister, had its own chapel, kitchen, refectory and cloister. Only the very ill would have stayed here overnight, rather than return to the dormitory. Cistercian infirmaries also looked after monks recovering from bleeding with leeches. The whole community was bled in rotation, every 3 months a treatment believed to improve their health. The infirmary hall would have also used by the abbot and his guests as a dining room before the abbot lodging. To the right was built in 1335. Later may have served as a misericord. In front of us we see 2 table legs, which have been rooted to the exact spot for over 850 years. The drains in front of us would have been used by the infirmary and the kitchen. Croxton Abbey continued to expand into the 13th century, with King John awarding the monks an annuity of £5 from the Exchequer of Ireland in 1200, before exchanging it for land in Shropshire in 1206. Croxton was relatively prosperous at this time, drawing the majority of its wealth from sheep farming. By 1315, the monks were supplying more wool to the continent than any other religious house in the country, with transactions being recorded with Florentine merchants well into the 1420s. The abbey's wealth is reflected in the purchase of a house in London by Abbot William of over £20. The abbot was the leader of the monks and lord of the manor. Important guests would have been entertained in these lodgings, which were very similar to a circular lord's house, with a screen passage and hall and a private chamber above. All the monks had to swear total obedience to the abbot as part of the rule of St. Benedict. To our left are remains of a spiral staircase. The latrines are also fascinating, and the stone drains remain completely intact, with the tunnels which ran underneath the complex still clearly visible. This brings back a stark human element to everything. The smell of these without any modern day plumbing must have been most unpleasant, especially with 70+ monks living here during a warm summer. In the well-preserved east range, adjoining the south transept to the church, were the sacristy, chapter house where the monks held daily meetings, parlour and day room. The monks' dormitory occupied the floor above. At the south end, the stone-lined drains of the latrine are still visible. This would have been the dormitory for the monks. Through the passageway is the cobbled floor. The long corridors echo with centuries of footsteps, a place of passing through, viewed through the lens of the past. The worn cobbles on the floor and the dark cold ceiling. This would have been a busy thoroughfare, throughout the day as monks went to and from the cloister for the daily duties and readings. South range originally housed from left to right, the stairs to the dormitory, the warming house, the refectory and the kitchen. These rooms were subject to many alterations, including the shortening of the refectory and the insertion of later fireplaces and windows. The cloister was at the centre of monastic life. Monks would have studied at desks or carrels in the covered walkways. The grand processional door to the left provided access to the church. The nave was occupied by the lay brothers, servants who performed most of the manual work of the abbey while living under a monastic rule. They attended fewer services than the choir monks. By the 14th century, Croxton's financial situation had worsened. The strains of royal taxation, the repayment of loans, and the care of the elderly, combined with bad harvests and the plague, were a drain on the abbey's resources. This room was originally split into two by a solid wall. This bay contained the book room, where volumes were stored horizontally in wooden cupboards. The sacristy at the other end housed liturgical vestments and vessels. It would have also had its own altar. With the death of Theobald II de Vernon, the last of the senior direct male line of the family, in 1316, leaving 4 daughters as his heirs, the patronage of the abbey became the inheritance of the eldest heiress, Joan de Vernon, who married secondly Thomas de Furnivall, 2nd Baron Furnivall of Hallamshire, into whose family Alton and Croxton passed. There are a number of disputes between the monks and the Furnivall concerning the use of the abbey lands and property, and the monks barricaded themselves in the abbey for 16 weeks in 1319. It wasn't until July 1319, with the help of the local landowners, that the monks received an assize of novel Dissolution, which was an act to recover the land, and their property usage was returned to them. With an income of less than £200 per year, the abbey should have been suppressed under the Suppression of Religious Houses Act of 1535, which dictates all religious houses with a low annual income should be dissolved. The monks paid a fine of £100 for a royal licence to continue until 1538, when the abbey was surrendered and the land and property sold off. The king granted monks pensions, with the last abbot receiving an annual sum of £26.13. The board in front of us regarding the high altar The high altar of the Abbey church stood in the east end of the building, which was rebuilt from the 1190s in a very unusual and splendid form. Foundations show that the east end of the church was semicircular and surrounded by an aisle or ambulatory and 5 projecting chapels. This plan was unusual in English Cistercian churches and was probably inspired by French designs, familiar to the patrons of the abbey, the Verdons, who owned land in Normandy in 1204. The high stone vaults that seal in this end of the church were very grand and must have been expensive. They were not finished until the mid-13th century, a long time after the rest of the church was finished. The unusual east end of the church, as it looked in the 13th century, the radiating chapels were used to celebrate private masses. In the south transept, the stairs used by the choir monks to pass from the dormitories to the church for night service. Before us are several stone coffins, near to the high altar. They are the tombs of the founding family and benefactors. In the 14th century, abbots preferred this part of the church for burial, rather than a chapter house. Now let's see Croxton Abbey from above with the drone footage. We hope you enjoyed the tour of Croxton Abbey. If you do like our content, please hit the like, subscribe button and leave us a comment. Take care from History Seeking.